Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger. Welcome to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche. Today is March 4th, 2021, and there's a lot to talk about, Helga, especially on the strategic side of things, where we're seeing, on the one hand, some tragedies that are unnecessary but are unfolding in Yemen and Syria. We're seeing what's so far somewhat undefined direction from the United States. So let's start with Yemen. What's the situation there?
Well, I think we should be conscious of this incredible double standard, which is being pushed by the mainstream media, where if you listen to them or read them, the Western countries are all about human rights and democracy, and the countries of Russia and China are all the dictatorships and authoritarian regimes. But I think, if you look at the situation, as you mentioned, Yemen and in particular in Syria, I think this is such a hypocrisy that it makes you sick in the stomach. Because what we see right now in Yemen is a genocide where about 20 million people are in various phases of starvation. And this is not new. This has been coming. It was known since more than a year. The UN authorities, the UN World Food Council has been warning about it, and nothing has happened. There was now the so-called donor conference, which is a farcical expression given the fact that they don't give anything. UN General Secretary Guterres said that what is required for the situation in Yemen, where a very large part of the population is completely food aid dependent because the Saudis are blocking the ports and airports so that food aid and medical aid cannot be poured in, that there must be an immediate 3.8 billion for food and medical programs to save the population. And what was the result? It was a ridiculous 1.7 billion, which is less than last year. And if you think about the trillions of dollars and euros which are being wasted and spent to save the speculators, to save a bankrupt banking system, then 1.7 billion is less than the proverbial peanuts. So then there are reports, that 400,000 children are already in the process of starving to death, that their skin would be like pergament, that they have hollow eyes. I mean, this is incredible. It would be so easy. And I don't want to hear the word democracy and human rights anymore from anybody who is not mobilizing to change the fate of this Yemen people. It would be so easy to, bring in ships to the port of Sana and basically say, that this food will be delivered and there is no resistance permitted by Saudi Arabia. There would be means to pressure Saudi Arabia to allow this food to go through. And the fact that this is not being done cries to heaven. And, I think that this is a complete bankruptcy declaration for Europe. They're not doing anything about it. And, the whole so-called West. Now, not very different is the situation in Syria, where reports are that 1/3 of the population is suffering hunger. Many of them are going towards starvation if this is not changed. And, that is naturally the result of the long war, waged by the United States in particular, betting on Al-Qaeda and Nusra for regime change against Assad. And then naturally the last year was completely made worse, everything by the corona pandemic. So you have a country in rubble and, torn apart by the effects of the pandemic. So what is now happening? Israel is making airstrikes against Damascus since weeks. I mean, we had eyewitness reports from people in Damascus who said that they are absolutely horrified. And naturally, the pretext is that these would be groups which are associated with Iran. So this is reaching now a critical point because the special envoy for Syria of President Putin, Lavrentiev, he said that the patience of Russia is running out, also of Syria naturally, but especially of Russia. And there could be some counter strikes against these strikes on Damascus. Now, that would obviously immediately have the potential to flare up the conflict into a big one. And, you know, one should see that in light also that the Biden administration launched their first military strike last week on the Syrian side of the Iraqi-Syrian border, also supposedly hitting some groups associated with Iran. And in retaliation for an attack on the US and coalition forces inside Iraq a few days earlier. Now, this was completely illegal because, you know, if that was the case, that there were these attacks, the proper way to deal with it would have been to take it to the UN Security Council. There was no immediate danger. It was several days afterwards and therefore fulfills the criteria of a revenge strike. So Tulsi Gabbard, who is one of the few people with guts in the United States, it seems, she said that it was laudable that some of her colleagues in the Congress attacked that, but that they failed to attack the larger policy of regime change against Assad, which is still going on, where the United States again is working with Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra to accomplish that. So I think this is really terrible because this is the first major indication that the Biden administration is going back to the policy of humanitarian interventions, of regime change. And that has been also demonstrated by Blinken, who had a phone discussion with self-appointed president of Venezuela, Guaido, saying that he would work with him in order to return Venezuela to democracy. Now, it is that policy of regime change, of intervention in the foreign countries for the so-called purpose of democracy, but creating havoc, which has brought the world to the present point of total crisis. So this should be condemned. And, I think we need to absolutely seek for a different policy, because if you continue that, it is a question of time when this really will explode into a big confrontation.
You mentioned the Russian reaction to the Israeli strikes in Syria. There's also been new sanctions against Russia on the Navalny case coming from the U.S. And Biden has had some things to say this both toward the U.S. and China. Where do you think this is headed?
Well, I think, while Biden in the virtual speech to the Munich Security Conference said that he did not want to have a reflexive return to the Cold War and bloc thinking, well, unfortunately, his deeds are not going in this direction. So there was an assessment by the Russian Valdai Club, which is basically a think tank and an association of intellectuals. So they came out with the analysis that the Biden administration is fully back on a line of confrontation against Russia and China. And naturally, the most important aspect of that is going back to the pivot Asia policy of the Obama administration. And, unfortunately, this started already in 2017, in December, 2018, January, where a whole series of US strategic and national security documents were published, which defined Russia and China as the key adversary. And just before the Trump administration went out of office in January, they published a document which comes from this period called the US Framework on the Indo-Pacific. And this paper was classified, but they published it, they declassified it in January of this year, obviously to create an environment, where the military-industrial complex would define, what would be also the policy orientation of the Biden administration. Now, what this document basically calls for is the old thesis, which comes from the PNAC policy, Project for a New American Century Doctrine, which the neocons basically developed at the end of the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union disintegrated, and which was pushed in particular in 1992 by Dick Cheney, which was the idea that the US is the only dominant country in the world, that therefore, this new Indo-Pacific doctrine framework basically has the same idea, that, US dominance and US values will be defended. And actually what it means in practice is a policy of containment against China in particular, against Russia. And, there were several criticisms of this by pointing to the fact that the very harsh policy, especially in respect to Taiwan, has the seed also, of leading to a war, because Taiwan is part of the One China policy of China, and they have declared it to be one of the red lines. So I think this is all very dangerous, and naturally it brings up the big strategic question. It is a fact that China is a nation of 1.4 billion people. They have a 5,000-year-old history, and they were the technologically leading nation in the world until the 17th century. Many of the inventions, were developed in China, and they have managed in the last 30 or 40 years to bring 850 of their own people out of poverty, and they are now a rising nation. So with that large population and a policy which is absolutely based on innovation, on the emphasis of scientific and technological progress, as is demonstrated by their breakthroughs in space technology, in fusion technology, in fast train systems. You cannot contain such a nation other than with war. But if the United States then says, no, we will have a Indo-Pacific policy where, they build the so-called Quad, which is this alliance of Australia, Japan, India, and the United States. And if they try to pit these countries basically in order to contain China in the Indo-Pacific, this is the prescription for disaster. So I think it's the shift to the Indo-Pacific is something one has to pay very great attention to, and it is quite ridiculous if one can find a humorous element in this whole thing, that the German defense minister Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer is now planning to deploy one German frigate into the Indo-Pacific to show flag, that she is part of this American NATO deployment. But the big danger is that behind all of these things, and that was articulated by General Secretary of NATO Stoltenberg at one recent NATO meeting, is the effort to extend NATO globally, to have global NATO with the aim of regime change in Russia and China. And that is for sure the seed for a third world war.
And the Chinese are responding to this, as are the Russians, but mostly patiently, but giving out more clear warnings recently. What did you hear from China recently, Helga?
Well, I think that the clarity with which China responds to these things uh, are getting clearer by the day. So there was yesterday a very, I think, important article in Global Times where they said for the first time that the policy to try to contain the growth of China, the effort to fight together with many other developing countries for a better living standard of all of its citizens, that this policy is evil. And that also, this article said that the effort to protect intellectual property is completely legitimate. But if that turns into an effort to prevent China and other developing countries from scientific and technological progress, which is the precondition for an improvement of the living standard, then this is malicious and evil and cannot be tolerated. So I think that there is a very strong response, and given the fact that Biden also has made clear in many of his election speeches, in his campaign speeches, that he wants to make climate change the absolute center of US foreign policy and national security policy, and that he is going to basically force countries to comply with the Paris Accord. Now, given the fact that China presently has 250 gigawatt power coming from coal plants and is building another 95, basically 95 gigawatt power plants based on coal. This is, a big bone of contention. And China is also helping many other developing countries to build modern coal plants, which are environmentally very, very good. And China plans to have until the year 2050 still 50% of its energy coming from coal plants, and only comply then in 2060 with the Paris Accord. But you can be sure that China is in absolute certainty going to have enough nuclear power by that time to be able to go out of coal. But this is what this means is an unveiled effort to prevent the development of the developing countries, because there is no way how you can develop the third world without coal plants. In many countries, this is the only way they will have the necessary energy to get out of this incredible poverty and disaster in which many countries are in. So I think this is a extremely evil policy, and I think it should be called that way. And I'm quite in agreement when China says this policy is evil.
Well, given that the Chinese obviously saw what happened in Texas 2 weeks ago, they're probably not going to cover much of the land area of China with windmills. Now, meanwhile, this brings up the whole question of what about the United States? We've heard repeatedly over the recent years of the commitment for internal improvement, for infrastructure, developing new platforms, and yet on the whole, it hasn't been done. And there's a new report out from the American Society of Engineers, I think, basically pointing out that this disinvestment is wrecking the physical economy. Uh, shouldn't we be concentrating on rebuilding America's infrastructure as part of a global plan to upgrade power production and so on?
Well, I mean, this report which you mentioned from the American Society of Civil Engineers is a big report. It's 170 pages, and it goes through in great detail the miserable condition of American infrastructure. Many categories get a D, not a C, but a D. That is schools, roads, bridges. So the American infrastructure is in a terrible condition, which we know from many on the side reports from our colleagues from New York, from New Jersey, if you go through some of these roads in New Jersey, it's you better don't drive with a little Italian Fiat 500 because you may disappear in a pothole. And it's really something which needs to be repaired. And I mean, this entire military budget which the United States has, and every time these missiles are launched against Syria or some other country, this makes the missile producers very rich and the military industrial complex very happy. I mean, the missile producer Raytheon, I hope I pronounced the name right, but they make billions by these actions, and they want to keep the wars going. But that money is clearly not deployed for the repair of schools, for the repair of the roads. And, what now this report demands, or basically says, is that the next 10 years must have an investment of 2.5 billion, trillion investment in infrastructure in the United States. Now, we had many years ago estimated that, and we came to a much higher calculation because, this is not just to repair the existing infrastructure, but if you want to go and build a modern transport system, like a fast train system, which the United States has zero, if you want to build something like what the Chinese have, you probably would need minimum an investment of 8 trillion or more. If you want to go a little bit more ambitious and build new cities in the not so populated areas in the United States, you could easily say that an investment in the realm of 20 trillion in the next 10 years would really modernize the United States in a way which would be beneficial for all the citizens and make, really a completely different situation. So, it really comes back to the question, is this policy of permanent war really in the interest of the United States or not? I would say it is not. It would be much more in the interest of the United States to reconstruct the United States itself, to spend all of that money, retool all the all the firms which are now producing for the war machine, retool them and get them going for the domestic reconstruction of the United States. I think this would be better for the United States and it would be better for the world.
You mentioned Raytheon as one of the military-industrial complex companies. The current Secretary of Defense, retired General Austin, was from the board of Raytheon. Now, instead of Cold War and containment, we're seeing, again, a lot of this, the Atlantic Council report on the longer telegram and so on. Are there any signs that there are people having discussions between the US and China, either local or any other cooperation efforts?
Yes, there are two tiny signs of hope, but hope. One is a discussion between the main person in charge of fighting the pandemic in China, Zhong Nanshan, who had a Zoom conference with Dr. Fauci. And they emphasized that the coronavirus and pandemic is the enemy of all of mankind, and therefore the efforts to fight it must be put together and united. And I think this is the right spirit. There was also the 5th China-US Subnational Legislator Cooperation Forum, and that included legislators from many Chinese provinces, but also state legislative leaders of Alabama, California, Delaware, Hawaii, Iowa, Michigan, and Tennessee. And the ambassador of China to the United States, Cui Tiankai, he pointed to the fact that, all of humanity is really sitting in one boat, that, the two most important economies in the world have everything to gain from cooperating with each other and absolutely nothing by having a policy of confrontation. So one would hope that, on that level, there is a return to a different approach of cooperation. And, that, we have so many problems in the world right now. I mean, if you think about the unbelievable misery, of many countries, I mean, if people don't change and have an agapic approach that we are one human species and that, it would be so easy to get rid of famine. Most diseases are absolutely containable. If there would be common research, we could, make crash programs like it was done with the vaccine for the COVID-19, where some researchers developed a new technology in less than a year. And this approach, they came actually from from cancer research, and this was a firm in Mainz in Germany, and they basically shifted at the beginning of last year to trying to find a vaccine against the pandemic, and they succeeded. So this you could try to do with all major diseases, and you could really go and try to find cures for many diseases which cause incredible suffering on millions of people. So why not shift? Can we not shift the orientation, stop geopolitical confrontation, which is, really the method which led to 2 world wars in the 20th century, and which will lead to the annihilation in the 21st century because of thermonuclear weapons if it is not stopped. So I think this effort to contain China with the Indo-Pacific policy is definitely the biggest danger right now. And I think that the idea to really make a step in a different direction and define the common aims of mankind, like, for example, the defense against asteroids, comets, the idea that you can detect earthquakes through especially the exploration of space, that space research and development has so many beneficial side aspects for the dealing with the problems on Earth, that I think we have to absolutely make this jump. And given the fact that we had in February 3 Mars missions, which so far were all extremely successful, where a high degree of international cooperation occurred in each single mission, why not take that a step further? And rather than trying to militarily divide space up, which some people, are clearly thinking, which makes nuclear war also only more likely, because the shortage of time of delivery of nuclear weapons is shortened by such policies. Why not really go and make a huge leap, go to a new paradigm in thinking, and rather than destroying each other on Earth, that we find a new paradigm of tackling the challenges which confront all of civilization. So I think that there is hope, absolutely, but I think it requires a major shift in policy.
Well, and I would say to our viewers that you can join us to take paradigm. Come to the Schiller Institute website, become a member, contribute, get our new report on the Great Leap Backward, which exposes some of the elements of the policy of the oligarchy, the Great Reset, the Green New Deal, but become active, because what Helga just laid out is a very positive potential that can come because of the weakness of the people who are trying to push for war to hold their empire together. So Helga, thanks for joining us this week. We'll see you again next week.
Till next week.